Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. In the winter of 1847, on a cotton plantation nestled along the banks of the Oconee River, an enslaved woman named Celia was subjected to a degradation so profound that even the cruelest overseers refused to speak of it openly. Her master, Aldrich Fontaine, had grown obsessed with what he called experiments in breeding superiority. When plantation ledgers were discovered in 1923 beneath the rotted floorboards of an abandoned stable, researchers found entries so vile they were sealed from public view for nearly 60 years. What Aldrich demanded of Celia defied nature itself. The Fontaine name first resurfaced in academic circles in 1987, when researchers from the University of Georgia conducted a comprehensive study into antebellum agricultural practices across the state's river plantation corridor. Among the documents they examined were fragmented county records from Putnam County, and it was here that scholars noted curious gaps and deliberate omissions regarding the Belumbra plantation during its final years of operation. The estate had once been considered a marvel of southern prosperity, its rolling fields producing some of the finest cotton in the region. But it was Aldrich Fontaine's reputation as a breeder of exceptional horses that had truly established his fortune. His prized stallion, a magnificent black Arabian named Emperor, was known throughout 3 counties as the finest specimen of equine bloodline money could acquire. Aldrich had purchased the animal from a Virginia trader in 1843 for a sum that scandalized his neighbors, yet the stallion's offspring commanded prices that silenced every critic. Those who knew Aldrich described him as a man consumed by notions of hereditary perfection, a gentleman farmer who read scientific journals from Europe and spoke endlessly of bloodlines and genetic potential. Following the death of his wife, Eleanor, during the yellow fever outbreak of 1845, those who worked his land observed a change in their master. His interest in breeding grew darker, his experiments more secretive, and the light that had once animated his ambitious eyes dimmed into something far more troubling. What emerged from that grief would soon destroy everything it touched. The story of how Celia came to Belumbra remained buried for over a century until a remarkable discovery in 1961 brought her existence back into the historical record. During the liquidation of a Savannah auction house that had operated since the early 1800s, a collection of archived bills of sale was donated to the Georgia Historical Society, and among these yellowed documents was a receipt dated March 15, 1846, bearing Aldrich Fontaine's distinctive signature. The document recorded the purchase of one enslaved woman, listed simply as Celia, aged approximately 19 years, acquired from the estate of a bankrupt South Carolina planter named Harmon Bledsoe for the sum of $800. What distinguished this particular bill of sale from the thousands of similar documents that recorded the systematic dehumanization of an entire people was a handwritten notation in the margin, added in Aldrich's own hand, which read, "Strong of frame and sound of health, suitable for purposes." Those final 3 words would take on a meaning so sinister that researchers who later examined the document could scarcely bring themselves to speculate on their full implication. Celia was initially assigned to domestic work within the main house, a position that placed her in direct and frequent contact with the master of Belumbra. A letter written in June of 1846 by Aldrich's cousin, a woman named Lucille Fontaine Marsh, who had visited the plantation for a period of 3 weeks, provides the earliest external observation of the dynamic between Aldrich and his new acquisition. Writing to her husband in Augusta, Lucille noted that her cousin seemed peculiarly interested in the new house girl, remarking that he watched her movements with an attention that bordered on unsettling and had twice inquired about her physical constitution in terms more appropriate to livestock than to household servants. Lucille dismissed these observations as the eccentricities of a grieving widower, yet her letter preserved a detail that would prove chillingly prophetic. She wrote that Aldrich had mentioned Celia's strong build would make her ideal for a special project he was contemplating, one that would cement his legacy as a pioneer in the science of superior breeding. Lucille assumed he spoke of farm work. She could not have been more tragically mistaken. The most detailed account of Aldrich Fontaine's descent into madness comes from an unlikely source discovered more than a century after the events themselves unfolded. In 1978, a retired schoolteacher named Harold Birch was clearing out the attic of his family's farmhouse in rural Baldwin County when he came upon a trunk that had belonged to his great-great-grandfather, a man named Josiah Birch, who had served as overseer at Belumbra Plantation from 1842 until his mysterious disappearance in 1847. Among the contents of that trunk was a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age but still legible, in which Josiah had recorded his daily observations of life on the Fontaine estate. The entries from late 1846 paint a portrait of a man growing increasingly disturbed by his employer's behavior. Josiah wrote that the master had taken to spending long hours alone in the stables, sometimes remaining there well past midnight, and that on several occasions he had overheard Aldrich speaking to himself about perfecting nature's design and unlocking the secrets that God had hidden within blood and bone. The overseer noted that Aldrich had begun acquiring strange texts from booksellers in Savannah, volumes written in French and German that discussed theories of animal magnetism, hereditary transmission, and the crossing of species boundaries. What troubled Josiah most deeply was his master's growing conviction that the vigor and strength of superior animals could somehow be transferred to human subjects through ritualistic proximity and controlled breeding conditions. The neighboring planters had begun to whisper about Belumbra, sharing accounts of strange lights burning in the stables long after decent folk had retired, and of sounds that carried across the fields on still nights, sounds that one neighbor described in a letter to his brother as neither fully human nor entirely animal. The Ashworth family, whose property bordered Belumbra to the east, reportedly instructed their enslaved workers to avoid the fence line after dark, though the reasons for this prohibition were never spoken aloud. Something was taking shape within Aldrich Fontaine's troubled mind, something that merged grief and obsession and pseudoscience into a vision so perverse that even those who suspected its nature could not bring themselves to name it directly. The physical evidence of Aldrich Fontaine's depravity might have remained hidden forever had it not been for the curiosity of a young historian named Douglas Whitmore, who in the autumn of 1923 purchased the abandoned Belumbra property for a modest sum at a county tax auction. Whitmore, a recent graduate of Emory University with a scholarly interest in antebellum architecture, had intended to document the deteriorating plantation house before it succumbed entirely to the creeping advance of time and kudzu. It was while salvaging materials from a stable that had partially collapsed during a storm the previous winter that Whitmore made a discovery that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. Beneath the rotted floorboards, wedged into a space that suggested deliberate concealment, he found a waterlogged metal lockbox containing a collection of plantation ledgers dating from 1844 to 1847. The earliest volumes contained ordinary records of cotton production, slave inventories, and livestock transactions, but the final ledger, covering the period from January to October of 1847, was something else entirely. Whitmore initially struggled to comprehend the coded entries that filled its pages, references to something called the experiment, and detailed notations regarding breeding protocols that seemed to follow no agricultural practice he had ever encountered. As he studied the water-damaged pages more carefully, a pattern emerged that filled him with a creeping dread. The name Celia appeared repeatedly, alongside that of a horse, identified as Emperor, with entries tracking lunar cycles, dietary modifications, and what the ledger termed optimal conditions for conjunction. A letter Whitmore wrote to a former professor in November of 1923, preserved in the Emory archives, reveals his growing horror at what he was uncovering. He wrote that he had found records of something monstrous, a systematic attempt to force an enslaved woman into unnatural congress with a stallion, all documented with the cold precision of a scientific experiment. Whitmore confided that he had not slept properly since beginning his translation of the coded entries, and that he was uncertain whether such materials should ever be made public. His professor's response, if one was ever sent, has never been found, but Whitmore's subsequent actions suggest he received counsel that urged silence over exposure. The most harrowing account of what transpired at Belumbra during those dark months of 1847 comes from testimony recorded nearly 90 years after the events themselves, preserved in the archives of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Writers Project. In 1936, a WPA interviewer conducting oral histories with formerly enslaved persons in central Georgia spoke with an elderly woman named Patience, who claimed to have been a young girl of 12 years when she lived on the Plantation. Though her memory had faded in certain particulars, the events of one January night remained seared into her consciousness with a clarity that time could not diminish. Patience recalled being awakened after midnight by sounds she initially could not identify, sounds that seemed to come from the direction of the main stable where the master kept his prized horses. She described hearing a woman's screams, high and terrible, mingled with the agitated whinnying of a horse, and then the deeper voice of a man shouting commands that the winter wind carried away before she could discern their meaning. The other enslaved workers in the quarters lay still in their cabins. Patience remembered, for they had learned that curiosity about the master's nocturnal activities invited consequences none wished to endure. It was not until dawn that Patience witnessed what she described as the most pitiful sight her young eyes had ever beheld. She watched from behind her cabin as two male field hands carried Celia back from the stable, her body limp and her legs seemingly unable to support her own weight, while the master walked behind them, issuing instructions about where she should be deposited. Patience recalled that Celia's dress was torn and that she made no sound whatsoever, her eyes fixed on some distant point that none of the living could perceive. In the days that followed, Celia did not speak of what had occurred in that stable, not to Patience, not to the other women who tended to her injuries, not to anyone. Her silence became a fortress behind which she retreated, and those who glimpsed her eyes understood that whatever had happened in the darkness had extinguished something essential within her. Aldrich Fontaine, meanwhile, recorded in his ledger that the first trial had been completed under favorable conditions. The horror unfolding within the stables of Belumbra was not a secret kept by one man alone, for dozens of souls knew or suspected what their master was doing to Celia during those long winter nights, yet the peculiar institution of slavery had constructed walls of silence more impenetrable than any made of stone or iron. The enslaved community moved through their days with eyes cast downward and lips pressed tight, understanding that to speak of what they had witnessed was to invite destruction upon themselves and those they loved. Patience would later tell her WPA interviewer that everyone in the quarters knew something evil was happening, but that knowing and speaking were separated by a chasm no enslaved person could safely cross. Beyond the boundaries of Belumbra, rumors had begun to circulate through the drawing rooms and parlors of Putnam County society, though they were discussed only in the most guarded terms. A letter written by Mrs. Caroline Ashworth to her sister in Milledgeville, dated February of 1847 and later donated to the Georgia Archives by the Ashworth family estate, makes reference to whispers about ungodly practices at the Fontaine place, though Mrs. Ashworth dismisses these accounts as the inventions of jealous neighbors who resented Aldrich's success with his breeding program. She wrote that she found it impossible to believe a gentleman of Mr. Fontaine's education and standing could engage in the sort of perversions that common gossip attributed to him, and that she intended to hear no more on the subject. The one white witness who could not so easily dismiss what he observed was Josiah Birch, whose journal entries from this period reveal a man in profound spiritual crisis. "The master has abandoned reason entirely," Birch wrote in an entry dated February 12, 1847, "and I fear that by remaining in his employ, I am becoming complicit in sins that will damn my soul for eternity." Yet Birch didn't leave, did not report what he knew to authorities, did not intervene on Celia's behalf. His inaction, like that of so many others who sensed the evil at Belumbra, formed another link in the chain of silence that bound Celia to her torment and ensured that her suffering would continue unabated. The ledgers discovered by Douglas Whitmore in 1923 reveal that what happened to Celia on that January night was not an isolated incident, but rather the beginning of a systematic campaign of abuse that continued for months with meticulous, almost clinical documentation. Aldrich Fontaine recorded each occasion on which he forced Celia into the stable with Emperor, noting variables such as the phase of the moon, the temperature and weather conditions, the dietary regimen he had imposed upon both woman and animal, and his observations regarding Celia's physical state before and after each encounter. The entries are written in a hand that betrays no emotion, no recognition of the suffering being inflicted, only the cold disappointment of a scientist whose experiment has failed to produce the expected results. With each unsuccessful attempt, Aldrich convinced himself that some minor adjustment would yield the miracle he sought, altering the timing, the conditions, the preparations, yet never questioning the fundamental depravity of his enterprise. In March of 1847, seeking what he believed would be expert guidance, Aldrich summoned a physician named Dr. Howard Crane to Belumbra under the pretense of examining his horses for signs of illness. Dr. Crane's personal diary, donated to the Georgia Medical Archives by his grandson in 1959, contains an entry from this visit that reveals the true nature of Aldrich's request. The doctor wrote that Mr. Fontaine had proposed something so contrary to nature and human decency that he could scarcely bring himself to commit the words to paper, and that when he expressed his horror, Fontaine had responded with calm assurance that science demanded the courage to transcend conventional morality. Dr. Crane recorded that he left Belumbra that same afternoon, declining payment for his visit and offering excuses about pressing obligations elsewhere. What he did not do, as his diary makes painfully clear, was report what he had learned to any authority or take any action to intervene on behalf of the enslaved woman whose fate Aldrich had so casually described. Like so many others who glimpsed the evil festering at Belumbra, Dr. Crane chose the comfort of silence over the burden of conscience, and Celia's ordeal continued without interruption or hope of rescue. As the spring of 1847 unfolded across the Georgia countryside, and the cotton fields of Belumbra burst into their annual cycle of planting and promise. A darker season was taking hold within the mind of Aldrich Fontaine. The ledger entries from April and May reveal a man whose scientific detachment had curdled into something far more volatile, his clinical notations increasingly punctuated by accusations and recriminations directed at the subject of his failed experiment. Aldrich had become convinced that Celia was deliberately sabotaging his efforts, that through some act of willful disobedience or hidden resistance, she was preventing the miraculous outcome he believed his protocols should have produced. A letter discovered among his papers, addressed to a colleague at a Charleston medical society but never posted, provides a window into his deteriorating mental state. In it, Aldrich wrote that he had begun to suspect the obstinance of inferior blood was to blame for his lack of progress, and that the woman possessed a cunning resistance that belied her outward submission. He speculated that she was somehow expelling his carefully prepared compounds or failing to follow the dietary requirements he had imposed, and that more stringent measures would be necessary to ensure her compliance. What those measures entailed became evident to everyone at Belumbra, as Aldrich began subjecting Celia to punishments that served no purpose beyond the expression of his mounting rage. He ordered her food rations reduced to a level that left her visibly weakened, and he devised public humiliations designed to break whatever spirit remained within her. Josiah Birch recorded in his journal that the master had ordered Celia to stand for an entire day in the yard before the slave quarters, wearing a placard around her neck, bearing words so shameful that Birch could not bring himself to transcribe them. The other enslaved workers were made to witness these degradations, forbidden to avert their eyes or offer comfort, forced to observe what happened to those who displeased their master. Patients would recall decades later that watching Miss Celia suffer those punishments taught every soul on that plantation that there was no depth to which the master would not sink, and no hope that anyone would be spared his cruelty. The final degradation visited upon Celia came in the sweltering heat of a June afternoon, an act so brutal that even those who had witnessed months of cruelty found themselves unprepared for its savagery. When Aldrich's impossible expectations remained unfulfilled, despite every adjustment to his protocols and every punishment inflicted upon his victim, he resolved to mark her with a symbol of his contempt that she would carry for whatever remained of her life. The details of this event come from testimony provided by a man named Samuel, who as a young apprentice to Belumbra's blacksmith had been ordered to prepare the implements of Celia's torture. Samuel was interviewed in 1892 by a local historian compiling accounts of antebellum life in Putnam County, and though nearly half a century had passed since that terrible day, his recollection remained vivid and troubled by guilt. He recalled that the master had come to the forge and demanded that an iron be heated until it glowed orange, specifying that the brand should bear the letter F, the same mark used to identify Fontaine livestock that had strayed from the plantation. Samuel described how Celia was brought to the yard before the assembled enslaved population, her arms held fast by 2 field hands who had been threatened with similar treatment should they release her. The master himself pressed the searing iron against the flesh of her left shoulder, holding it there as she screamed until the smell of burning skin filled the air and her voice gave out entirely. Aldrich reportedly declared before all present that he was marking her as unfit for purpose, a failed vessel that had proven itself incapable of fulfilling its intended function. The forensic evidence confirming Samuel's account would not emerge for nearly another century, when in 1989 construction workers unearthed human remains on the former Belumbra property. Among the bones examined by forensic anthropologists from the University of Georgia was a female skeleton displaying clear evidence of trauma to the left scapula and surrounding tissue, scarring consistent with a severe burn inflicted during life. The shape of the damage, according to the medical examiner's report, corresponded unmistakably to a letter, the very mark that Aldrich Fontaine had seared into Celia's flesh to brand her as his property and his failure. The earth of the former Belumbra plantation kept its secrets for 142 years before a construction crew inadvertently became the instrument of their revelation. In the autumn of 1989, developers who had purchased the long-abandoned property to build a subdivision were excavating the foundation for a model home when a backhoe operator noticed bones emerging from the red Georgia clay. What initially appeared to be a single isolated burial soon revealed itself to be something far more significant, an unmarked cemetery containing the remains of at least 37 individuals, all of whom had been interred without coffins, markers, or any official record of their existence. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation summoned forensic anthropologists from the University of Georgia to examine the site, and among those who answered the call was Dr. Arlene Myers, a specialist in historical skeletal analysis who had spent her career giving voice to the voiceless dead. It was Dr. Myers who first examined the remains designated as Burial 23, a young woman whose bones told a story of suffering almost beyond comprehension. The skeleton displayed evidence of malnutrition, of labor so punishing that it had left permanent marks upon the joints and spine, and most disturbingly, of deliberate trauma inflicted during life. Dr. Myers documented a healed fracture to the pelvis that was consistent with repeated violent assault, damage to the ribs suggesting blows from a blunt instrument, and the scarring on the left shoulder that unmistakably bore the shape of a branded letter. In her official report, Dr. Myers wrote that this individual had endured a pattern of sustained physical abuse over a period of months, abuse that went far beyond the already horrific norms of enslaved labor. Attempts to extract DNA from the remains proved inconclusive due to degradation over time, yet the historical record provided a context that left little doubt about the identity of Burial 23, the location of the grave, the age and sex of the individual, the specific nature of the injuries, and above all the branded mark upon her shoulder, all pointed to a single conclusion. Dr. Myers would later state in an interview that she had examined hundreds of skeletal remains throughout her career, but that none had affected her as profoundly as the bones of the woman she believed to be Celia. Following the branding, Aldrich Fontaine discarded Celia as one might dispose of a tool that had failed to perform its intended function, removing her from the household and assigning her to the most punishing labor the plantation had to offer. Despite the wound on her shoulder that had barely begun to heal, despite the months of systematic abuse that had left her body weakened and her spirit shattered, Celia was sent into the cotton fields to work alongside those who had spent their entire lives breaking their backs beneath the Georgia sun. Patience, in her 1936 testimony, described the transformation she witnessed in the woman who had once carried herself with quiet dignity through the halls of the main house. She told her interviewer that Miss Celia was a woman whose spirit had been broken into pieces too small to gather, and that she moved through her days like someone who was already dead, but whose body had not yet received the news. The other enslaved workers tried to ease her burden when they could, taking rows beside her so that they might complete some portion of her quota, sharing what meager food they had to supplement the reduced rations the master had imposed. Yet Celia rarely acknowledged these kindnesses. She had retreated to a place within herself where neither compassion nor cruelty could reach her, a fortress of silence from which she would never fully emerge. Yet the evidence suggests that even in her broken state, some ember of defiance still smouldered within Celia's heart. When archaeologists documented the former slave quarters during the 1989 excavation, they discovered a carving hidden on the interior beam of what records indicated had been Celia's cabin after her removal from the main house. The crude etching, made with a sharp implement and positioned where it would be visible only to someone lying on the pallet below, bore the letter C, followed by the rough outline of a horse that had been deliberately and forcefully crossed out. Researchers who examined this artifact interpreted it as Celia's private act of resistance, her way of declaring that she understood the monstrous injustice that had been done to her, and that she rejected it with whatever small power remained to her. In the darkness of her cabin, unseen by her tormentors, Celia had found a way to speak. The journal of Josiah Birch, which had documented the descent of Belumbra into depravity with increasing reluctance, reaches its most anguished passages in the entries from the summer of 1847. The overseer, who had witnessed months of unspeakable cruelty while maintaining his silence, had begun to crack under the weight of his complicity, and his writings from this period reveal a man tormented by guilt that would allow him no peace. He wrote of nightmares that visited him without fail each night, dreams in which he heard Celia's screams echoing through corridors that stretched into infinity, dreams from which he woke drenched in sweat with the smell of burning flesh lingering in his nostrils. In an entry dated July 19, 1847, Birch confessed that he could no longer meet his own eyes in the mirror, for the face that stared back belonged to a man he no longer recognized, a man who had sold his soul for wages and security. What the journal reveals next transforms Birch from passive witness to active participant in Celia's story. For in late July, he apparently resolved to help her escape the plantation. The details are sparse, but Birch writes of a plan involving a route through the swamps and a contact who would guide her northward, a plan that was discovered before it could be executed through means he doesn't specify. His entry from August 1st describes the master's fury upon learning of the attempted escape, and hints at punishments inflicted upon both the would-be rescuer and the woman he had tried to save. The final entry in Josiah Birch's journal is dated August 3rd, 1847, and contains only a single line written in a hand that trembles visibly across the page. God forgive me for what I have allowed. After this date, Josiah Birch vanishes entirely from the historical record, appearing in no census, no employment ledger, no church registry, nothing that might indicate what became of him. Local folklore, however, preserved a darker explanation. Folklorists conducting interviews in Putnam County during the 1920s recorded a persistent legend that the overseer of the old Fontaine place had hanged himself from the rafters of the very stable where his master had conducted those unholy experiments, his body discovered by enslaved workers who were forbidden from speaking of what they had found. The exact circumstances of Celia's death remain shrouded in the deliberate obscurity that Aldrich Fontaine imposed upon all evidence of his crimes. Yet the fragments that survive allow us to reconstruct the final chapter of her suffering with terrible clarity. The Plantation inventory ledger, discovered alongside the experiment records in Douglas Whitmore's 1923 excavation, shows that Celia's name was struck through with a single bold line on October 14, 1847, with no explanation, no cause of death recorded, no notation of illness or accident, simply a name crossed out as though she had never existed at all. Patience, whose testimony has proven invaluable in illuminating so much of this dark history, provided the WPA interviewer with her account of what she believed had transpired. She recalled that after the failed escape attempt was discovered, The master had subjected Celia to a punishment more savage than any that had come before, a beating administered in the yard before the assembled slaves that continued long past the point when Celia's screams had fallen silent. Patience told her interviewer that she was made to watch along with everyone else, and that she had covered the eyes of the younger children so they would not see what was being done to that poor woman. She recalled that Celia was carried away afterward, and that no one in the quarters ever saw her alive again. The forensic evidence uncovered in 1989 corroborates this account with the cold precision of science, for Dr. Arlene Myers documented extensive blunt force trauma to the skull of Burial 23, damage consistent with repeated blows from a heavy instrument that would have proven fatal. The medical examiner's report noted that the fracture patterns suggested the victim had been struck multiple times while lying prone, unable to defend herself from an attacker who continued his assault well beyond the point necessary to end her life. Following her murder, Celia was buried in the unmarked ground reserved for enslaved persons who died on the Plantation property, her grave indistinguishable from the dozens of others who lay in that forgotten earth. No marker bore her name, no record preserved the location of her final resting place, and for 142 years she lay in anonymous silence, waiting for the day when the earth itself would testify to the horrors she had endured. The destruction that Aldrich Fontaine had visited upon Celia would ultimately consume everything he had built, for in the years following her death, the master of Belumbra descended into a ruin as complete as it was deserved. Court documents from Putnam County reveal that by 1848, Aldrich had begun defaulting on debts that had once been serviced without difficulty, his meticulous attention to the business of planting having given way to neglect and erratic behavior that alarmed his creditors. Neighbors who had once overlooked the rumors surrounding his experiments now found reasons to decline his invitations and exclude him from the society he had previously enjoyed, their doors closing one by one until Aldrich found himself isolated within the decaying grandeur of his plantation house. Correspondence preserved in the collections of neighboring families describes a man who had aged decades in mere months, who was seen wandering his property at odd hours, speaking to persons who were not there, who had dismissed most of his household staff and allowed the grounds to fall into disrepair. The enslaved workers who remained reported that their master spent long hours in the stable with Emperor, the magnificent stallion whose bloodline had once been his pride, speaking to the animal as though it could understand his ravings. It was in the spring of 1851 that a field hand discovered Emperor dead in his stall, the horse's body bearing no visible sign of injury or illness, its death as mysterious as so much else that had transpired within those walls. 3 days later, Aldrich Fontaine was found in his study by a creditor who had come to demand payment on an overdue note. He had taken his own life with a pistol that had belonged to his father, and beside his body lay a letter that had been partially consumed by the flame of a candle he had knocked over in his final moments. The fire had destroyed most of what he had written, but investigators were able to recover a single fragment that had escaped the flames. The words that remained, recorded in the coroner's inquest and preserved in county archives, read simply, "She cursed me from the grave." Whether Aldrich referred to his departed wife or to the woman he had tortured and murdered, the historical record does not reveal, though those who knew the full story harbored little doubt about which ghost had finally claimed its vengeance. The story of Celia was buried alongside her body, interred beneath layers of silence that each passing decade only deepened. Following Aldrich Fontaine's death, the Belumbra property passed through a succession of owners, each seemingly more eager than the last to distance themselves from whatever dark history clung to the land. The plantation house was demolished in 1878, its timbers salvaged for other construction, its foundations left to be swallowed by the advancing forest. When Douglas Whitmore brought his discoveries to the attention of local authorities in 1923, he was met not with gratitude, but with resistance. Prominent families whose ancestors had neighboring plantations expressing concern that such revelations would cast an unfavorable light upon the entire region. The ledgers and documents he had recovered were sealed by court order and deposited in a county archive where they would remain untouched for decades. Dr. Arlene Myers encountered similar opposition when she attempted to publish her findings following the 1989 excavation, facing pressure from developers who feared the publicity would doom their subdivision project, and from community leaders who argued that some chapters of history were better left closed. Yet the truth, like the bones that had lain so long in unmarked earth, possessed a stubborn persistence that no amount of willful forgetting could entirely overcome. In 2015, a coalition of historians, descendants of enslaved persons, and local activists succeeded in having the former burial ground designated as a protected historic site. A simple stone was placed at the location where Burial 23 had been discovered, bearing no name. For no name could be proven beyond doubt, only a date etched into the granite, 1847. Those who visit the site today find a quiet clearing surrounded by pine trees, unremarkable save for that single marker, standing witness to horrors that words can scarcely convey. Celia's story, improbable as its recovery may seem, represents only one among countless thousands that remain untold, their truths sealed beneath rotting floorboards and unmarked graves scattered across the former slaveholding South. For every ledger discovered, 100 more have crumbled to dust. For every voice recorded, 1,000 more fell silent without witness. The stone in that Georgia clearing speaks not only for Celia, but for all those whose suffering was deemed unworthy of remembrance, whose lives were erased by those who believed that some crimes, if buried deeply enough, might never be called to account.